Good morning to everyone, and I thought I was the youngest person on this panel, but I was wrong. It's okay, Nicholas. So I'm just going to start with an excerpt of a reading I found online from Anna Grimshaw, who's spent a lot of time writing and studying James as well, and then we'll just go straight into it head first. James's distinctive contribution to the understanding of civilization emerged from a world filled with war, division, fear, suppression, and unprecedented brutality. He himself had never underestimated the depth of the crisis which faced modern humanity. In James's view, it was fundamental. It was part and parcel of the process of civilization itself, as the need for the free and full development of the human personality within new, expanded conceptions of social life came up against enhanced powers of rule from above, embodied in centralized bureaucratic structures which confined and fragmented human capacity at every level. This theme, what James later called the struggle between socialism and barbarism, was the foundation of his life's work. Again, that's from Anna Grimshaw. And perhaps, you have your thoughts on that already, to what extent you agree or disagree. But what I would like to know to get the conversation going is how relevant is this dichotomy that Anna presents at the end, that James himself highlighted, between socialism and barbarism? And how would you describe the tensions of our time if, in fact, they are not the dichotomy of socialism and barbarism? And I'm throwing that out for anyone to take up. David, let's go with you. Come on. Right. David just delivered the C.L.R. James Memorial Lecture at the 80th anniversary of the OWTU not too long ago. So maybe you can get us going.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Ardene. I didn't know you were going to just throw questions at us. All right. So, no, I think it's central in the sense that if you look at neoliberal capitalism today, in all of its manifestations, what you are seeing is barbarism in a significant way, both in terms of economic marginalization, the rich are getting far richer, the poor are getting poorer. All of the data that has come out on income inequality, whether it's by Joseph Stiglitz in the United States, whether it is the Roundtree Foundation, which recently published in December last year, a study on income inequality in the UK. If you look at studies in Europe, income inequality is growing. The richest 8 billionaires in the world have the same net worth of wealth as the poorest 50% of the world's population. And then if you go down into the social dimensions of unemployment, of structural unemployment and so on, of poverty, 25% of people living in the UK are living below the poverty line. In Trinidad and Tobago is a similar figure. Youth unemployment and poverty. Look at all of the data, the rise of crime and violence and so on. There's barbarism. And so that issue of socialism or barbarism is certainly there. Now, of course, what we may not have full time to explore is whether socialism is possible today, or whether, in fact, what is on the agenda is holding on to social democracy, which was the post-World War II social settlement and so on. And in James's very important book, World Revolution, which most people haven't paid attention to because they read the popular ones, Black Jacobins, Every Cook Could Govern, and so on, Beyond the Boundary. But World Revolution is a very important work because it was written in 1937, and it looks at what was happening in Europe in the period of the 1921 or thereabouts to 1937, which was the rise of fascism. and the struggles at that moment. And what James was essentially saying is that the crisis of capitalism, which was very evident then, this was even before the crash of 1929, was giving rise to moments of either moving to socialism or moments of holding on to social democracy, or fascism and barbarism, which was the rise of Hitler. And he was writing real time in 1937 about that period. Those writings are extremely relevant now because of xenophobia, racism, populism, insecurity as a result of a crisis of capitalism that was existing then, all exists now, and therefore James can explains what is happening today in terms of the rise of right-wing nationalism and populism in Europe and the US.
Aaron?
Hello.
Yeah, it's on. Yeah, we're hearing you.
Hi, yes. So first of all, let me thank the Bocas organizers for inviting me here. It's wonderful to be here for the first time. And in answer to that question, I had prepared, as I think all of us had, a longer talk, but I can excerpt and take out parts of it. And I have two passages by James which I think really epitomize a particular response to that question. Especially the notion of socialism or barbarism. And often our first response is to think, oh, well, that posits things as absolutes. Why socialism or barbarism? Isn't there any kind of middle ground? But I think, as David has been pointing out to us, there really is no middle ground when we think about the vast inequalities in the world today. And James, as discerning a thinker as he was, understood that very clearly. And I'm going to give you two moments in his life, and we've heard some fabulous quotes from James because we know that James is a very great writer, but I'm going to give you two political quotes which really, to me, are James at his best and also exemplify something about the way in which he thought about the world. So the first one is from 1938, and it's taken from a speech that James gave, an unpublished speech that he gave in New York. So 1938, this is a stage in James's career. He's left Trinidad in 1932. He went to England. He had a fantastically productive 6 years, which we can talk about more, in which he published. It was his greatest publishing period and most activist and intellectual period of his entire life. But he's gone to New York on what is supposed to be a 6-month speaking tour of the U.S. as one of the top Trotskyist intellectuals of the world. He goes in 1938, and 6 months turns into 15 years before the U.S. immigration officials get hold of him, and tell him to get out of their country. But he gives a speech in New York, and it embodies a particular style of James. But let's take it. He says the following. And keep in mind, this is a couple of months, a year before World War II is going to break out, and everybody who is a serious political thinker in the world is aware of the impending war. The idea that anyone who supports Britain in a war would be supporting democracy is either criminal hypocrisy or equally criminal stupidity. The British Empire is the greatest instrument of tyranny and oppression known to history, and its overthrow would be a great step forward in human progress. Side by side with the struggle for colonial independence must go the struggle for socialism. Either socialism with material progress, peace, and fraternal relations between peoples, or empire increasing racial hatred and imperialist wars. That's James in 1938. And all you have to do, if you want to think about the contemporary relevance of that, is substitute Britain for the United States. The United States empire is the greatest instrument of tyranny and oppression known to history, and its overthrow would be a great step forward in human progress. Side by side with a study for colonial independence must go the struggle for socialism, etc. So we see the resonance of James's work, and the truths that they contain are evident as much to us today. Remember, it was just the summer of last year in which the British government's official report on their imperialist assault on the Iraqi people was revealed, and it's as relevant as in 1938. So there's a particular style that we see in James. It's a very Caribbean anti-colonial intellectual style of a class-centered tradition of anti-capitalist political theory and praxis, which is wedded also to an aesthetic-centered tradition of anti-colonial cultural theory and practice. And it's those things together, that political theory and that cultural theory, which have produced, of course, this fabulous Caribbean intellectual tradition, which has a global renown today. Now, the second one I'll go to is a speech that James made in January 1967 in Detroit. And it's one of the only times in which he would actually speak about Fanon's very famous Wretched of the Earth. So this speech was a speech called From Dubois to Fanon. And James says the following. Fanon calls his book Les Damnés de la Terre. It is translated as The Wretched of the Earth, but I prefer The Condemned of the World. I want to end by saying this. The work done by black intellectuals, stimulated by the needs of a black people, had better be understood by the condemned of the earth, whether they're in Africa, the United States, or Europe. Because if the condemned of the earth do not understand their past and know the responsibilities that lie upon them in the future, all on earth are going to be condemned. That is the kind of world we live in. So the stakes here for James can never be clearer. For him, the colonial condemnation that has been the lot of black people in the world is going to encompass the whole of humanity. If the wisdom and experience of African diaspora intellectuals, that group of population which have been forced to pay the highest psycho-existential price for the Euro-American West victory is ignored. And this is a kind of warning and hope that James could announce at the end of the 1960s and the 1970s. It has great global resonance today with the advent of global neoliberalism, with all of the environmental questions that question human survival on this planet, which of course are omnipresent today, which he could not see then, but in the way that he politically saw the world, he could speak to with a prescience and vision that we can take something out of today. I'll stop there.
All right, and you know, that's a very sort of strident, I think, approach to, you know, James's analysis of his situation back then, of that time. And I'm sure that obviously there are ways in which we can adapt that to now and see where it readily applies. But I'm wondering if we are to reach the average person in the West Indies, and I want to localize it a bit, do you think there is a need then to reframe the conversation? Do we need to move beyond anti-colonial, because it's not so much colonial, even though we say neoliberalism and there's neo-colonization as well. And in the case of, you know, Martinique and Guadeloupe, you know, it's still effectively colonialism. But I'm wondering if there's another way to reframe that in the 21st century, in 2017, to get people to understand these ideas or appreciate them more.
Well, I'm sure, good morning, everybody. I'm sure there are, but I want to sidestep your question by really following Aaron and David to put James and his formation in context. And like you, I want to bring it home and bring it to Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, because James was such a towering international figure. He was so much a figure of the Black Atlantic and, you know, the transatlantic world, that we sometimes forget that he was very much a TNT person. I always remind myself that James left Trinidad at the age of 32. Naipaul was 18, I think. James was 32, so you know, he was a fully formed adult. And yes, of course, he grew up in a period of world tumult. He was a teenager during World War I. And just after he had left school, he witnessed personally, he was a young man about Port of Spain, and he personally witnessed the rebellion and labor protests of 1919 to 1920. He was, as everybody knows, a great admirer of Captain Cipriani, who was the first major labor leader in Trinidad and the predominant pro-labor politician of the 20s and at least into the mid-30s. Cipriani called himself a socialist, and he was a socialist of the British Labour Party tradition. He had close links to the British Labour Party. He was a great admirer of the British Labour politicians of the 20s and 30s, and his body, the TWA, was linked to the British Labour Party. So I think James was very much formed as a writer, and Ken probably will speak more about that, and as a political thinker in those 32 years. Now, he was not a Marxist. When he left Trinidad, he was a socialist of the British parliamentary type, I guess what today we would call a democratic socialist. He became a Marxist in England. And Erin is so right. Those few years in England, 32 to 38, were incredible. And a period of incredible productivity and research. Black Jacobins, which I think was his greatest work, came out in that period. Modern, what was it, Revolution, and several others, yeah. So he became a Marxist in Britain, and he has said in Beyond the Boundary, the people who mostly made him a Marxist were his working class friends in Nelson, Lancashire, a small, depressed English mill town in northern England where his great friend Leary Constantine lived, and for the first part of his period in England he stayed with the Constantine. And those white radical left-wing Nelson folk actually teased James because they said, in effect, James, you're just a middle class, you're a middle class person. And James was a middle class person. He came out of a very respectable black Bajan origin Trinidadian family. And they turned him into a Marxist, along with, of course, his profound and intense reading, which he did in the 1930s. So I haven't answered your question, but I've tried to just make the point that we mustn't forget that James's political formation, as well as his development as a great writer, took place in those 32 years right here in Port of Spain.
Yeah, and he says that. He makes that point repeatedly.
And he says that.
He credits Trinidad and Tobago, he credits the space for that, for what he was able to produce later on. But, okay, so let me perhaps pull back on that question and go to the point of James's commitment to the masses, the proletariat. You know, that's where he believed power resided, and that's where many people, of course, all Marxists generally believe that, all socialists tend to believe that. And I'm wondering, where do we see that ideology applying today? Where do we see the manifestation of it today? So in the US, as a form of resistance to Trump, you have the Indivisible manual that was developed and which has spawned many various protests around that country. And I'm wondering, you know, do you see a nexus anywhere? Do you see the relevance of his ideas in terms of the power of the mass movement and the proletariat in particular, and the Black Jacobins, you know, as they were in Haiti? Do you see that resonating even in Trinidad and Tobago? Do you get the impression that in the wider Caribbean people feel empowered?
Well, I would say that what James has to say about people variously described as working people, ordinary citizens, the proletariat, and so on, what he has to say about them and their possibilities, that is at the heart of his vision of a new society and a new kind of politics. And that book, the Cipriani book, and lots of things that he did in the first 32 years of his life in Trinidad, a lot of the things point to his interest in and belief in certain qualities that had persisted in the life of what we call, let's call them proletariat for now. There were certain qualities there that had somehow escaped civilization and that had toughened themselves under oppression. And these were the seeds and germs that we had to find in order to make a new society and also to become what we really are. So let me just, in the novel Minty Alley, all those writers, Mendes, James, and all of them who were writing in the late 20s and 30s, they looked at the yard, they looked at the dwellers of the yard. So you have Triumph, you have La Divina Pastora, you have Minty Alley. Now, and it was very strange to me that he should write a book about Cipriani, but he was interested in leadership. And all through his life, he was looking at leaders and the failure of leadership, because his concept of the proletariat and the possibilities of the proletariat ultimately was saying that the proletariat, it is through the self-activity of the proletariat that we will form the mass party, which will do what needs to be done without being told so by anybody. So gradually, James rejected the idea of the leader. It's very interesting, you see, that when the Cipriani book was done over or reprinted, the pamphlet, it's called The Case for West Indian Self-Government. James was making the case for West Indian self-government throughout his life. And the proletariat was a class in society that was going to provide the resources, the imagination, the new insights. I remember in Modern Politics, where he's writing about Rousseau's attitude to the political. James eventually became hostile to the notion of the political party.
Right. But did you get the impression that people are connected to those ideas of what a working class can do and their role in shaping a government and a society?
People are connected?
That the working class is connected to its power.
Well, you see, we talk about the moot, barbarism and socialism. And I was going to say, if you didn't ask me anything, well, I'm very happy with the terms because I could do what I like with them. And I think James would say, so he did, he can't deny me, James would say that when he talked about barbarism, barbaric activities and barbaric persons in the world, barbarism was a symptom of something that was fundamentally lacking in the human person in the region. And a lot of his writings, a lot of his references to Shakespeare and the great writers and so on, had to do with trying to tell people, you know, art and culture and learning have something to do with the evolution of the person. And he looked at Rousseau's criticism of the political party and the politicians, and then he looked at Paul Rousseau's attempt to find a way or to develop a new form of politics. Of course, Rousseau fell onto a crooked idea about a kind of maximum leader. So we forget that. But the great thing about Rousseau is that Rousseau saw that the party and the leader who was telling people what to do was a no-no. And I think all his life, James did that. He did not succeed in getting any of the Caribbean politicians to take an interest in the idea of the proletariat being the source of true politics. Lloyd Best was to pick up later on and say, we don't have any politics here. And I think James died knowing that we didn't have any politics.
But David, I think this is something you would have a lot to say on. I mean, as the leader of the MSJ, to begin with, you are concerned with getting working people involved in politics and getting them to recognize their stake in this. And I'm wondering, do you feel that people are connected to that sense of empowerment?
No, not directly. Let me just preface that, though, and tack back in terms of how James saw the reality of the Caribbean working classes coming out of slavery. So I want to quote from another lecture which he gave in 1966, early 67 in Montreal, about the making of the Caribbean people. It's published in a book that came out fairly recently called You Don't Play with Revolution. So this is what James said. They, West Indians, wanted not only their freedom, but to remove their masters and make themselves masters of the island. That is what happened essentially in San Domingo, and that is what happened in Cuba in 1958. They got rid of the masters and made themselves masters of the island. I believe the above to be a characteristic of the West Indies and our history. When West Indians reach a certain stage, they wish to make a complete change, and that is because all of us come from abroad. Liberty means something to us that is very unusual. In the history of the West Indies, there is one dominant fact, and that is the desire, sometimes expressed, sometimes unexpressed, but always there. The desire for liberty, the ridding oneself of the particular burden, which is a special inheritance of the black man. If you don't know that about West Indian people, you know nothing. They have been the most rebellious people in history. Then in the preface to Black Jacobins, he speaks about the need for us to understand and analyze the economic forces of the age, their molding of society and politics, of men in the mass. So I'm now linking the relationship between individuals and the mass, which Ken spoke to. Their molding of society and politics, of men in the mass and individual men. The powerful reaction of these on their environment at one of those rare moments when society is at boiling point and therefore fluid. And then on Walter Rodney, the question of power, another talk which he gave about a year after Walter was assassinated. James said this: the taking of power has to become the common discussion among the Caribbean people. A revolution is made by the revolutionary spirit of the great mass of the population, not of individuals, but the great mass of the population. And you have to wait for that. You do not know. There is no calculation. Revolution comes like a thief in the night, so you had better be ready. So he's always saying that it is based upon the mass of the people that fundamental change will come, and that inherently in the historical experience out of slavery through indenture up to freedom, West Indian people, Caribbean people have wanted more and more freedom, more and more liberty, and to rid themselves of the masters, whether those masters are external colonial masters or internal or a combination of both. The challenge for us has been what he wrote in Party Politics. Mm-hmm. And I think the quote may have been read this morning, I wasn't able to hear it, but in which he very scathingly attacked the West Indian middle classes as a particular peculiar group of people. He said not that they're bad individuals or intellectually inferior. In fact, intellectually they're superior probably per capita to any other society in the world. But that because of their relation to production or lack of relation to production, they therefore have no ideas. And it is that predicament that we are now confronted with, where we have had the middle classes in office through political parties, controlling political parties and so on, from the 50s to now, and therefore instilling in the ideas of the working class in Trinidad and Tobago specifically now, that their interests are not as workers, but that their interests are along lines of other ethnicity, race, religion, geography, and so on. And therefore, we have had this division of the mass of the people along ethnic lines historically. And it is, how do we break that culture and that consciousness? That is a huge challenge, which James would have recognized as being the fundamental question of the day.
So there are two things here. There's the issue of the middle class, and then, the breaking that culture, and to what extent we have developed or grown from that. And then there's the issue of the working class and the consciousness that happens at that level. I should just stick to that, the problem of the education system, which of course does not teach the history. Bridget writes in the newspaper trying to get us to know the history. But our generations, even my generation, far less for the younger generation, don't know about the struggles of the 30s and the 40s and so on. Yeah?
Yes, I'd like to actually Are we coming out? Yeah. Right. I am glad that you quoted that particular speech from 1966, making of West Indian people given in Montreal, because there's another part of that speech in which James says the following: Some of you, I have no doubt, are profoundly aware of the savage ferocity of some of the West Indian rulers today towards the populations who have put them in power. In 1966, this is appearing in island after island in the Caribbean. What we have to do is see the origin of this, its early appearance at the very moment when freedom was won. And I give you that passage because I think we need to understand that James was a very profound critic of Caribbean post-colonial politics and what Caribbean post-colonial politics was actually going to be. And I think that coming back to the question that was posed to me after my first intervention, James would have very clearly seen that anti-colonialism and the thought of the anti-colonial movement continues to be relevant because flag independence does not make you sovereign and it does not make you independent in any kind of profound way. And just after this quote, he goes back to the Black Jacobins because he thinks that the Black Jacobins and the politics that he saw in Haiti in the period of independence was actually very important in terms of understanding the nature of a Caribbean polity. And I'm not really going to go completely into that, but I want to make some comments about the importance of the Black Jacobins because I was hoping that Nicholas was still here so I could tease him a bit about this and provoke him. But I do not agree that Beyond the Boundary was James's most lasting and enduring work. I think that was clearly the Black Jacobins, and it was for a number of reasons. So I certainly would agree with Bridget there. And I just want to list a few of those reasons. Now, many people believe that it's his finest single intellectual accomplishment, and there are a number of reasons for this. Black Jacobins was the most enduring and influential history of the Haitian Revolution in the English language. It was when it was published, it continues to be so. In tracing the relationship between metropole and colony, it actually anticipated a lot of later studies in what is now known as post-colonial studies, transatlantic studies, these kinds of things. More directly to our concerns, though, it introduced the momentous importance of the Haitian Revolution to audiences throughout the English-speaking world, and it directly influenced later texts which would make the argument about the exploitation of enslaved labor from Africa and the centrality that had to the building of the West. And of course, I'm specifically speaking of Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, which, as we now know very clearly, was decisively influenced by C.L.R. James and by the Black Jacobins. Pardon me? No, not a plagiarism, but Williams specifically asked James what he should write his doctoral thesis on, and James told him, this is what you should, and Williams went and did it, okay? And we have clear evidence of this from a number of sources now. We have a situation in which the Black Jacobins becomes the central text in which at least 3 generations of radical activists and intellectuals get to know what the meaning of slavery and freedom was within the Western Hemisphere. It's had a colossal impact throughout the world and throughout Caribbean history. It is, if we say that Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery is the most debated work of Caribbean history, then James's The Black Jacobins is the most influential work of Caribbean history. So I just wanted to make that particular point about the importance of the book. And for those who haven't read it, it's a must-read, the one book that you must read on the Caribbean history before you die.
I just want to come in there, taking off from what both David and Aaron said, and also your question. Have we, do we have to go beyond the anti-colonialism? Of course, James was an anti-colonial writer and thinker. But as both David and Aaron have made clear, and Ken too, he was he had no illusions about what independence would mean and what the transition from colonialism to self-government and independence would mean. He was extremely prescient. And I just want to read 2 very, very short quotations. Yeah, I have to hold the book up. 2 very short quotations. This is from his pamphlet, The Case for West Indian Government. That was a short pamphlet which was spun off from the longer work, The Life of Captain Cipriani. And it was published in 1933. So we are long before the flowering of independence movements. And this is what he said, quote, "No one expects that these islands will, on assuming responsibility for themselves, immediately shed racial prejudice and economic depression. No one expects that by a change of constitution, the constitution of politicians will be changed. Shall I repeat that? Nobody expects that by a change of constitutions, the constitution of politicians will be changed. But though they will, when the occasions arise, disappoint the people and deceive the people, and even in so-called crises, betray the people, yet there is one thing they will never be able to do, and that is neglect the people. So he's making the point that for all of this, self-government will at least mean that the politicians have to pay some attention to the feelings and grievances of the people, where the colonial regime really did not have to. And let me just one second very brief quotation, and this is from Party Politics, and we earlier heard a very spirited reading from Party Politics. This is published in 1962. Now, just to be a little bit of devil's advocate, I don't think he would have written Party Politics as he did had it not been for the celebrated falling out with Eric Williams and the celebrated expulsion from the PNM, which took place in 1961, nevertheless. This is what he writes in Party Politics, 1962. After he makes a point, as he does in the most acerbic language, he makes a point that TNT under Eric Williams, this is not James yet, just the content. TNT under Eric Williams, he said the people were still marginal, and we still had an autocratic leader. He was now an elected politician, an elected prime minister rather than a British appointed governor, but still autocratic. All right, I'm quoting James now. It's a much quoted statement. A national flag and a national anthem and colonialism dressed up in new clothes do not make a new society. And in characteristic Jamesian style, he summed up, quote, "The king is dead, long live the king. Colonialism is dead, long live colonialism." 1962.
Thanks for that. Ken, you want to?
Yes. About his involvement with Williams and the PNM, in 1958, when he came, he did present to Williams a set of proposals about the reorganization of the party. And when you read those proposals, you could see that James was really saying, I don't like the politics you guys are playing, and if I'm going to be here and working for you, I want it changed. These are the things I want. And he put that to Williams. Of course, that was completely ignored. But he didn't, in other words, he didn't start thinking about party politics in Trinidad and Tobago after the break. He came unhappy about the way it was running. The second thing I want to say, if everybody has a favorite book, well, I have been reading Beyond the Boundary for 50 years, but there's another one that I'm going to be reading for the next 50 years. It's called Special Delivery. The Letters of C.L.R. James to Constance Webb, 1939 to 1948. Apart from the lyrics, the boy really had lyrics. But apart from the lyrics, I would say that for intensity, wisdom, passion, philosophy, politics, thoughts on art, culture, society, race, popular culture, including some very important statements about the power of the cinema and the way in which the cinema can be used to reach ordinary people. For all of those things, no book by James is more rewarding. Special delivery, every ball is a special delivery in this book. Nothing, and it's an important work, because nothing written by or about James shows more poignantly the inner drama of this outwardly composed figure, and his struggle to recognize and to integrate the personal life with the political and public life. And you read that book, you see this man living on Shakespeare, living on the great writers. And you see in this book, in the kinds of things, I don't know why he's puzzling the head of the fair sex with all these things about philosophy and Hegel and the dialectics and so on.
I will not rise to that bait.
It's the same thing with John Donne. He read some real funny poems to these ladies that he was quoting. But anyway, I have a feeling he wrote 1938 to 1948. This man was writing letter after letter to Constance. We don't see any of her replies, but when he sometimes says, you send me a postcard, or I'm waiting to hear from you, I do think she took him on. She did. When he was discussing her poems and discussing her problems, she would tell him about those. And she was a radical, you know, outwardly she was a radical. But I think the love was coming out of him. And you really see the loneliness and the agony and the longing for a good relationship with a woman in James. But he was teaching her about Hegel. He was teaching her about the dialectics. He was telling her the difference between Lenin and Stalin and the Trotskyists. He was, you know, he was really trying to educate her. He did some brilliant literary criticism, analyzing her poems, telling her what her strengths and weaknesses were. But in that book, you see that when we talk about the masses and the proletariat, look at what he says to her in one of the letters. This is the only thing I'm going to quote. This letter is only partial. It is inadequate. I would like to write for you such letters as were never written before. To sit down and write to you as I cannot even write for the proletariat, but as I will write for them one day when they are ready. They will unloose power from me, the power I now feel surging in me. I know it is there, but only their actions can bring it out. Same with you. Same with you. Curious, the affinity I find myself always making now with you and the proletariat. Telling the lady she's the most beautiful thing you ever see and the most intelligent and the most promising writer in the world, but now he's saying, you're just like the proletariat. And if the proletariat does act, and a voice is needed to give its actions their fullest implications, I not only know that I will do it, but that then I'll write to you as never before. No one will ever write as I shall write then. No one. The revolution is a release of power, and release for me too in every direction. He really saw that everything was connected with everything else. And this muse that he picked up with, this, what Walcott would have called the reluctant leopard of slow eyes. This is the one who caused James to bring together and fuse, for the first time in his writings, all the things that he was interested in about human society and politics and culture and science. And that is why I'm really going to hang on to this book until God called me. And if I ain't finished reading, when he called me, I say, wait, I have a few letters to read again. By the time, brother.
And I might add gender, because I am actually surprised that my colleague has not mentioned the way that Constance Webb, when James met her in 1938, was 20 years James's junior, which means that she was 18 or 19. He was 38 at that time, shortly after he got to America. But she was also a budding Marxist, an intellectual who would later write a biography, a serious biography of Richard Wright, and was certainly someone who was an intellectual interlocutor and a comrade of James rather than simply a love interest of James. But even though James had written in a discerning and fascinating way about women in previous work, his short story Triumph, for example, the unforgettable character Maisie from Minty Alley, he also was to start thinking about the conundrum of the question of gender and gender relations in modern society. And we can see that through some of those same letters with Constance Webb, which are contained within that volume. So I will give you one example from a 1944 letter that he wrote. Oh, by the way, I'm writing a book on C.L.R. James and Sylvia Wynter. That's why I'll have all of these quotes, so, quickly at hand. With the increasing opportunities that modern production and the development of ideas based upon it gives to women, a new type of woman arises. She is called a career woman. The name is stupid, but nevertheless very revealing. A man is never a career man. That is his right and privilege. He can have his career, and the finest fruit of his successful career is wife and children. But the woman is called career woman because her career in modern society demands she place herself in a subordinate position or even renounce normal life. The social dice are loaded against her, and the plain fact of the matter is that they are loaded not only in the economic opportunities, but in the minds of men. The men cannot take it. I know my own sex reasonably well. With the best will in the world, a man, a good man, unconsciously demands that a woman submit to him. It is what he wants that matters in the end, not what she wants. Some men are crudely egotistical, others are not. They believe in equality, but the practice of society dominates them. It must, as long as they do not consciously oppose it. This is James in 1944, okay? And what is so remarkable about it, and it's not to suggest that James did not have many difficulties surrounding the back and forth ways in which he thought about women's participation in the new society and his take on gender relations. I'm not suggesting, for example, here that James was an ardent pro-feminist in the 1940s or later in his life. He was not, even though he thought about those issues very deeply. But there is a fascinating way in which, in those letters, you can also see James trying to grapple at the first time with this. And this is a tendency that you see throughout his writings onwards. So when his unpublished autobiography is finally published, whenever that may be, hopefully in a few years' time through the new C.L.R. James Archives project with Duke University Press, you'll read his essay, My Experiences with Sex and Women, in which he makes all of these marvelous comments about his failure and his difficulties to live what he calls a truly human existence with a woman due to his absorption with intellectual matters. And I think that that is also a very important and poignant lesson that James has for us today. I'll stop there.
Yeah, if I could just stick it before you come in, Ken. I wanted to set the context of James in the U.S. in that period, 38 to the 40s, because it was not simply about his relationship with Constance. I mean, he may have expressed a lot of the ideas through those letters, but this was a very important period of his development as a Marxist, both theoretician and also in the practice in the United States, where he's working with ideas around dialectics, because that is when he writes the very important work, Notes on Dialectics, where he really developed his position as a foremost Marxist theoretician in terms of the understanding of the dialectical methodology that Marx had established coming out of Hegel, and also his collaboration with Raya. I could never get her last name. Right, thank you very much. I could never pronounce her last name. Right, and
Grace Lee Bocas also.
Sorry?
Grace Lee Bocas.
Grace Lee Bocas,
yeah,
right. So there were women, very powerful women theoreticians involved with James in that experience. in the late 30s and early 40s. So I think it is both his interplay with his practical work of writing and engaged in practical politics in that collective that would have also begun to influence his perspectives on gender. Because, for example, a very informal discussion I had with his first cousin, who's still alive, Mr. C.L.R. Austin, who lived with James and James' first wife in Trinidad here, because that was around the time of Minty Alley. And Mr. C.L.R. Austin was quite a bit younger than C.L.R., and Austin was named after James, whose first name, of course, was Cyril. Spoke about this first wife working extremely long hours after she did her normal job in typing all of James's manuscripts and so on. Of course, when James left Trinidad and went to England, that was the end of that relationship, as has been perhaps with other West Indian men who migrated and so on, and women at a later stage of migration. So I just want to make the point that period in the United States was a very critical period of his revolutionary ideas, the development of his revolutionary ideas, and his interaction with film, because he used to go to the cinema and look at films. And then, of course, he was living an underground life, which was part of his expression to Constance. He was living in the underground. He couldn't write openly as C.L.R. James. He had a pen name and so on nom de plume. And he was living a period of great repression too, in that post-World War II period and the rise of McCarthyism. So it was a period where human interaction was particularly important for him in that very hostile environment in the U.S.
Yes, if I... Oh.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I had a lot about gender, and when I look at the equivalence between the woman and the proletariat, that was the climax of what I thought he was saying about gender. But before, when I got the invitation to do this, to take part in this, and I thought I would have a spiel to do my own thing, I decided that I'm going to make a list of, if we want to know James is, and like Bridget, I wanted to claim him back for Trinidad and Tobago. Look at his relevance to us. So the way to deal with this was to make my short list of what are the issues in Trinidad and Tobago today, and then see if James in his writings touches. And the list I made was equity, the lack thereof; integration, the lack thereof; party politics, too much of; art and literature and the popular arts, the artificial separation between them, and the continuing efforts to commodify them, rather than to recognize their nurturing qualities with respect to the individual and the society. 5, violence against women and the children who come out of their wombs. This violence may be seen as part of the anger that is about to erupt in our society next week, maybe, after 50 years of independence. But it also suggests that there is a suppressed debate about gender, about the place of women in society and economy, and in the minds of men. And I decided I would focus on the 2, party politics, too much of, and the one about women. So the little bit I read there was part of that, and interesting, the very quotation, she is called a career woman, the name is stupid, etc., is the quotation I used to go into that issue.
Well, because we don't have much time left for this part of the talk, because we want to entertain questions from the audience, I would ask us to talk about cricket. I don't think there's any way we can talk about James in 2017 and not address cricket in 2017, and and some of the ideas perhaps that have not seemed to filter down to now from several decades ago.
Well, I would do what Chalky says. Chalky says calypso is in everything, and everything is in calypso. Well, for James, cricket is in everything, and everything is in cricket. So I think all we're saying here, right, has some kind of connection with beyond a boundary, which everybody agrees was, the book where James presented himself and his sense of society, history, culture, everything. But I agree, we need to say some particular things about the cricket.
Yeah, I mean, one of the really extraordinary, this is not necessarily about cricket, one of the really extraordinary things about James was obviously, and everybody has said it, the breadth of his interest. Why he's a person who it's impossible to pin down. Now, David will not agree with me, but I think he was much more a man of letters in the broadest sense than a political thinker, far less a political activist. And at the risk of annoying you, David, I think those years he spent in the USA, I don't want to call them wasted years, because they were not, but I do think his involvement in extremely arcane Marxist theoretical debates in very, very small groups, which were splits of splits of splits. In a country, I mean, the notion that the USA was close to a socialist revolution in the 1940s is almost as absurd as it would be to say it today, Bernie Sanders notwithstanding. It seems to me, though I recognize that in the narrow world of Marxist theory, his writings of that period are important. I think his much broader importance to the world and to the Caribbean and to TNT is as a writer, but a writer with an extraordinary broad range. And to take Ken's point about it all started in Trinidad, before he left Trinidad, age 32, he had consciously prepared himself as a writer in many different genres. One was sports journalism. Mm-hmm. He wrote on cricket in the Trinidad newspapers in that period. Fiction, the famous short stories. He was one of, if not the creator of the barrack yard fiction genre. Biography. And as somebody said, I think it was you, Ken, one of his abiding interests was the biographical method as a way of studying history, studying politics, the dialectical relationship between the leader and the movement. So whether it was Cipriani or Toussaint, famously in Black Jacobins, or Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky in the course of the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union. Later, he became fascinated with Nkrumah and his relationship to West African independence. Polemical essays, everybody's heard of the Beacon Group, and James was one of the main writers of that short-lived but extremely important period, 29 to 32. He wrote polemical essays, biographical essays, book reviews. So, and then, as everybody has mentioned, a bit later in life, he became a great, what would we call it, cultural critic, a devotee of popular culture.
But Bridget, wouldn't you say it was all political for James?
Everything is
political. all of his work, and decidedly, consciously so.
I have no doubt everything was decidedly unconsciously political. But I think he was much more of a humanist and a man of letters than a political thinker. But, I mean, than a politician or political thinker. But that might be my personal bias.
Just keep in mind, we have not discussed cricket yet.
Yeah,
No.
Well,
Let me just add one sentence before I say my bigger piece.
Let's let David answer. And then,
In terms of cricket, we could sum it up with one sentence, really, and that is the state of West Indies cricket reflects the state of West Indian societies and our governance. Total state of collapse. That's it. And bad governance, right? And bad governance. So, but in terms of what Bridget said, two things. Clearly, he was an intellectual in the best tradition of the intellectual. Yes. And his famous talk at Mona, I think it was, in the 60s, about the artists
in the Caribbean.
Right. Signified politically what he saw as the role of the intellectual and the artist in the society, namely to bring about fundamental transformation through the raising of consciousness and so on. And in that regard, we have, my view now, of a failing of many of our intellectuals and artists today who see themselves as commodity or whatever and don't see themselves as transformative and helping us to understand our reality and therefore to bring about transformation. And in that regard, James was consistent. Now, as political thinker, I think he stands far and above virtually everybody in the 20th century as a revolutionary thinker and theoretician. Political activist, no. And so in his later life, for example, he was looking around for examples of leaders who were trying to bring about fundamental change. He identified Michael Manley, he wrote a little pamphlet about Michael Manley and so on, which of course turned out not to be realistic. And the other one was Rawlings Jemot, sorry, not Rawlings, in Ghana.
And also the Polish leader.
Like Valenza, right. Yeah. But particularly in Ghana, there were many critiques because there were some initial efforts of going forward, which then collapsed later on. But he was searching and could not find them. And again, it was a relationship between leader and mass and some change relationship between the two that he was seeking to find. But yes, he did not succeed as a political activist, but I don't think that his failure as a political activist to lead a movement to power or to influence a movement to power is a reflection of his weakness as a political thinker, which is why Lloyd Best, even though Lloyd was avowedly anti-Marxist, Lloyd could not come to terms with the fact that he recognized James as the foremost thinker and would not admit to himself, and that was a polemic I wanted to have with Lloyd, that Lloyd could not admit to himself that James came to those conclusions on the basis of Marxist dialectics. Yeah.
And I want to come in right on that comment because, yes, Bridget, I do fundamentally disagree with you on that point. And the reason why I do is that I believe that James was a fundamentally political thinker. Now, his work in the 1930s, when you read that work and you think, this is a very, very smart man. But he is fundamentally bourgeois, and he is fundamentally liberal in his understandings in those texts like Minty Alley and all of those, as fascinating contributions as there were. James needed social movement to write, and he got that social movement in the 1930s, and it's Marxism and the power of Marxist thought, which I do not think in any way is a limiting body of thought, which actually allows him to write texts like the Black Jacobins. It also allows him to write texts like Beyond the Boundary, and I'll give you a quote from Beyond the Boundary. James is reflecting in Beyond the Boundary about the transition in his thought in the 1940s, how he started to reorganize his thought about the world after he realized that the socialist revolution was not going to take off in the United States. So he says, for example, that it took nearly a decade of incessant labor and collaboration to break with it and reorganize my Marxist ideas to cope with the post-World War world. That was a matter of doctrine, of history, of politics, and economics. These pursuits I shared with collaborators, rivals, enemies, and our public. We covered the ground thoroughly. Now, hear James now. In my private mind, however, I was increasingly aware of large areas of human existence that my history and my politics did not seem to cover. What did men live by? What did they want? What did history show that they had wanted? Had they wanted then what they wanted now? The men I had known, what had they always wanted? What exactly was art and what exactly culture? And that's what takes him to write Beyond the Boundary. That ability to try to reorganize his thought on the world. So this very period in the 1930s to the 1950s in the United States, the Johnson Forest tendency, that political grouping, was perhaps the most powerful Marxist tendency in the English-speaking world. They were the ones who did the first translation of into English of Marxist economic and philosophical manuscripts. They were a very, very powerful and important intellectual tendency. The theories of state capitalism that they developed in State Capitalism and World Revolution and the invading socialist society are used by Marxists still today to try to understand the nature of China, to understand the nature of the relationship between the United States and China at the moment. So I do believe that James, as a fundamentally political figure, decisively influenced by Marxism and by global Pan-Africanism, is something which produced his most creative and his most important work in a variety of genres after he actually left Trinidad. And that's a position I will take, even though I do respect and acknowledge the fact that there are many Jameses.
All right, so I think we have to end there for now and open up. I'm sure some of what you want to say could come out in a question and answer segment at this time. So we want to invite questions from the audience. Is there a mic? Oh, okay, great. Yeah? Okay, take a... So we'll take a few and then have the panelists respond.
All right. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the wonderful information that was put out by the entire panel. Let me just start by addressing the question raised by Brother Abdulah. And, you know, we coming out of the 20th century, we see that Marxists have always disparaged, you know, anybody who's involved in what they call this, you know, identity politics, as having a kind of an unsophisticated, unscientific understanding of reality, as something that divides. And you mentioned it, Brother Abdulah, in your presentation, that ethnicity and religion, as opposed to workers. I find this dichotomy a little bit difficult for us to understand in the 21st century when we look back on things. One is that the gentleman in the blue shirt, I didn't get his name right. Aaron mentioned James himself in the 1960s in a presentation asking people to, discussing Fanon, and as you said, mentioning the work of the black thinkers, and saying that if you don't understand that work, the condemned of the earth, as he referred to the wretched of the earth, you know, we will not move forward. Fanon, who he was talking about, also made some very important interjections. Fanon said, for example, that that the problem with Marxists is that they didn't understand the way that color influences Hegel's master-slave dialectic. And he pointed out that blacks needed to express pride in the very socially constructed category that white society denigrates, and that unless you do that, he argues, you would be unable to move forward in the dialectic. This is Fanon himself speaking. And so Fanon projected, you know, advocated that we had to go through what he called the specific before we got to the universal. He said, and let me just quickly add that when you look at the 20th century, the workers' movement, the people who are the head of the workers' movement were also at the head of the black liberation movement. People like Elmer Francois and so on, Christina King and all these guys, they were the ones who celebrated emancipation in the early days. All the heroes of the workers' movement in the Caribbean, the major heroes, are the same heroes of the black liberation movement in the Caribbean. Walter Rodney, Maurice Bishop, Franz Fanon, C.L.R. James, you name them all. So the two things, and what I find interesting is in the 20th century, there was an orthodox branch of Marxism that sought to divide what I would call the left. The 21st century is about a new left that is not divided in that way. And I just want to get some feedback from the panel. If you think that that notion, that contempt for identity politics is something that we need to continue with, or if even in James and in Fanon and in Rodney and others, we see the birth of a new kind of thinking that doesn't see ethnicity as something that divides the working class. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, but we do ask you to keep questions short, and if you could perhaps limit your comments or questions to one, that would be helpful. No, we'll just take a couple more before we get responses.
Hello, my name is Haven. I don't think we should have a session like this without at least David, because I believe he might be the only one who had some long-standing personal relationship with James. I don't know who else may have had. My very few encounters, James told me, the only thing we shared really was that we had the same birthday, not date. He was a little 30 years older. And he told me he was trying to make David into a political thinker as a successor, so I don't know.
Thank you. Other questions or comments?
Yeah, hi. What I wanted to know, just go back to when you mentioned the anti-colonial. It's interesting because part of James's brilliance is also his potential to be polemic, insofar as I see it anyway. But I want to ask any of you just to complicate him a little bit in terms of, according to people like David Scott and Sylvia Winter, the need to rehistoricize. Because it's all well and good to historicize James's, say, spectacle in We on the Boundary, and Black Jacobins. But I wanted any of you to complicate him a little bit in your own opinions. Can you see a need to re-historicize James himself?
Okay, thank you. I think we can take some answers now.
What does historicize James himself mean? I think you need to be more specific, because I literally do not understand.
For example, David Scott says the anti-colonial has descended into post-colonial nightmares. That idea that we need to re-historicize the revolutionary romance, for example.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I got you.
Sorry, thanks.
Yeah, we'll take questions. We take answers to those questions now.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I think the point that I made earlier was misunderstood, so let me just restate it. I'm not suggesting there's a dichotomy and so on, or that there should be. And yes, okay, let me make the point. Yes, there are some Marxist tendencies historically, particularly in the Caribbean, in the 60s, into the 70s, and so on, which did not take into account the realities of race and our historical experience in that regard. And that was wrong fundamentally. But that's not the point I was making. It was a response to a specific question from Ardene about why is it that you do not have a political movement that is based fundamentally around the issue of class, and as James had suggested, is what is necessary to bring about fundamental change. And my response to that was that in the specific context of Trinidad and Tobago, we have had party political divisions along lines of race, religion, geography, Tobago, Trinidad, and so on. And that culture and consciousness that has developed in our society over the last 60 years is a very difficult culture to deal with. And I could speak to that even in the context of union organization, that if party A is in government and the oil workers trade union wants to mobilize workers at a state company to struggle around a common interest, workers who are supportive of that party based purely on their ethnic identity may not support the struggle when they would benefit from as common a thing as a wage increase. Okay? So I'm just saying that that is a reality that we have to address. It is not suggesting that we do not factor in and so on, both and class, race, gender, all those factors. And therefore the new social movements James would have pointed to, he would have been very excited by Black Lives Matter, as he would have been very excited by Occupy Wall Street movements and all those new social movements, which you would have seen as the movements of the present and the future.
Complicating, James? Does anybody want to do that?
What? What historicizing?
Okay, yeah, okay, sure.
Yeah. I really don't know what it is to historicize James. I would say that what we have to do is to bring James home in practice, in reality, that what he says about the mass party and the kind of consciousness raising that is necessary to bring about a mass party which would govern for itself and not be told what to govern, that I think that is the way in which one can historicize James. James that American period, which I don't agree with Bridget. I think it was a very I think it was a very useful period, and the most useful thing about it for me was that during that period, James arrived at an understanding of the Hegelian dialectic that none of his cronies understood. He was able to see where Lenin was lacking in understanding, where Trotsky was lacking in understanding. And the simple thing that he understood, that James understood, was that Hegel was not simply an ideal philosopher. Hegel believed in materiality, which is what Marx and they picked up. But for Hegel, every material object or thing or event had embedded or concealed in it a figurative and symbolic meaning, which was just as real and important as the material.
But for James, you look around and be sure of your material reality. And if you get a command of your material reality, all the figurative elements in it would come out. As in the case of Matthew Bondsman, who was a riffraff, who was a ne'er-do-well. His sister was a prostitute, the family and thing. But when Matthew Bondsman picked up a bat and started a bat, even the prudish aunts would say, Matthew Bondsman, the only thing he good for is cricket. And James says, I can't understand that. If James could bat like that, he have to be good for something else.
Okay, Aaron?
Right?
Yeah? Let's just move along. Sorry, we're just running out of time now. So.
Yes. In terms of rehistoricizing James, now, first of all, I think that there is a very distinct difference between the reading of James that Sylvia Wynter, who's written about 3 or 4 separate essays on James, and David Scott are doing, okay? My approach is more similar to Wynter's approach. I mean, I've disagreed with Scott both publicly to his face and in writing about his reading of James in his book Conscripts of Modernity, in which he actually suggests that there is a switch in James's work from a narrative of revolutionary anti-colonial romance to one of tragedy. I actually don't think so in terms of thinking about James in that same period in the 1950s, 1960s. I think that you see in James a very clear sense that the future of a Caribbean nation may very well be neo-colonial, but at the same time, you're striving against that. Okay, and I think that there's a problem there in the way in which Scott is actually theorizing the distinction between an idea of revolutionary, romantic anti-colonialism and something which is more profound as or more suggestive for him, which is tragedy. I don't actually see that in James at that particular point in time. I also think very directly that James's legacy can be mobilized to think of very current problems, as I've been saying throughout this talk, without the idea that we have to historicize James and somehow put James in his contextual 20th century place, implicitly suggesting that he's not quite as relevant as we might think to the 21st century. I see direct relevance straight across, okay? So that's what I would say in response.
And I just want to say I agree completely with what all three of you have said. And I think another aspect of his legacy and what he should mean to us. As we all know, James was a lifelong, devoted student of literature, world literature. He had a passion for British literature, but he read extremely widely. So I think he represents for us a reminder how important it is for all of us to read. We are at a Bocas Lit Fest. How important it is for all of us to read widely, not parochially. And I believe James read everything he could get his hands on. And how important it is for us to think critically. So I think he highlights for us one of the not so good aspects of our day, which is the decline of reading, the decline of respect for literature, and the sort of collapse of the recognition that without deep reading and thought, it is difficult to produce a politics or a society which can genuinely take us forward. So I think that's one of the great things about James.
Okay, so we can take a couple more questions, yeah?
I'll try to get to the point as quickly as possible. There's a moment in the later part of James's life when he returns to Trinidad and he's editing the newspaper for the PNM, I think it was. He goes to a party meeting and somebody throws a brick at the stage. And it sends him into this anguished reconsideration of what is he trying to do. And I think that it's very instructive to hear you discuss him, whether he's a man of letters or a political thinker, because that's when these two worlds seem to collide in his head. And I would argue that, in retrospect, he's emblematic of a certain recurrent pathology in West Indian politics to confuse these two categories, because there's a sort of abstract intellectual quality to a great deal of post-independence politics that founders when it's confronted with the tribalism of West Indian society. And that if you look at a lot of the implications of James's arguments, particularly in something like the Arab Spring, which had very similar radical underpinnings intellectually, it founded very, very quickly on the practicalities of governing a tribal society. And I just wondered what your thoughts on that were, because it seemed to me that would be the most obvious reapplication of his ideas in the 20th century, and that's going on right now. And almost every one of those countries that was liberated in very much the same way has come apart.
Thank you. Okay, let's just take one more over here. Okay. It just means we don't have any women asking questions, but that's all right.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay.
No, I know. I saw her. I just, yeah.
Just
sorry,
a very brief note. Whether James was a literary critic, a creative writer, or a philosopher of socialism, what we did not appear to interrogate is the fact that he was articulating a worldview still centered or informed by Europe. So, for example, the way in which he looked at, examined, probed Haitian society in Black Jacobins, he did not look at it from the point of view of the Africans who made that revolution. What motivated them, what animated them into rebelling? He contextualized that within the context of France, the French Revolution of 1789. Did not recognize that there is a whole philosophical tradition articulated by the African himself, which has its own independent resources and history, which could motivate such a revolution.
Thank you.
This to me is a great limitation.
Thank you very much. Okay, Funcho, let's just take one more over here, please.
I'm Jane Bryce. I just wanted to respond to Bridget's point about C.L.R. James as a reader, and also Aaron's point about his feminism, because in the 80s in London he was tangentially involved with the Race Today collective, which was run by his nephew Darcus Howe. And in 1981 or 2, I think it was, he gave a lecture in which he talked about the young African-American women writers who were just then starting to be published in Britain. You couldn't read them in Britain because they were being published in the States up to that point. So he had to have been reading them in the American editions. And I don't know how he got hold of them. So people like Ntozake Shange, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Toni Cade Bambara, who were writing their very early work, he made the statement at that lecture that they were writing some of the most important literature in the world today. And of course it turned out to be true. So just an illustration.
Thank you very much. So we just need to be very brief.
Very short. Yeah. Yes, I'm glad that point was made, because there's something that I was going to say at the very end, and you're absolutely right. So he was interrogating not just the issue of gender, but also the issue of race on that question as well. And so I disagree with the point about James's interrogation of, say, revolutionary processes from a European standpoint. So the quote I gave about in that lecture was exactly the opposite of that, where he said it was the very nature of West Indian people, where we came from, that we all came from abroad. I didn't give the full quote, but he referred to the fact that people in Africa were not enslaved, so they brought that particular experience, and that is why we are the most rebellious. So I don't think that he interrogated it purely from a Eurocentric point of view. I disagree.
Yeah. 2 points quickly. In terms of the comment which was made at the back, I have to admit, first thing I thought was that whatever I was saying on stage, if somebody threw a brick at me, I would be concerned too, and I might lose my political focus. But I do find that it's amazing that it is always the fault of the left, isn't it? It is always their ideas which are so impractical, rather than the power of capital, elite domination, centuries of domination and frustration of working people who are also abducted by ideologies of racism, imperialism, patriarchy. patriarchy. And I think that sometimes when we think about the failures of the left, and of course the left has had massive failures over the last century, we could actually recognize what the left has actually been battling against, okay? And therefore put that in proper context in terms of what the left has actually been doing. On this question of 3 black women writers, yes, from the 1981 talk that James did, it was one of his last published speeches, and certainly when you read a lot of the records of the time, as I have, James was so excited and was so thrilled about the emergence of black women writers. And he's very clear, as he says in his writings, and I quote, that women are a future that men must learn. He's, of course, riffing off of Laming's Natives of My Person. And he says at one point in one of his lectures he gives in 1976 that men constitute an elite in relation to women, and women have got a capacity which men have got to learn. And I think that that still applies today as it did when he said so 40 years ago.
Okay, Ken, you'll have the last word.
Yeah. My last word. I just want to sketch out my two main points. That when I did this bit of note-taking before, I said that James is a great exemplar and that his whole life was an epic about the building of the nation. And that when you talk about James's relevance today, the relevance of James is that he was an exemplar and a model about reading, about writing, about working hard, about focusing on reality, etc. And that is the greatest sort of bulk relevance. And the second thing I want to say is to agree strongly with Bridget that James was essentially a humanist. He was essentially a person involved in art and culture at the deepest levels. And all his political thinking was informed and enriched and made original and different because of that base that he had in humanism and culture and reading and art and so on. So he was a great political thinker because he was a great humanist.
Ken said my last line.
All right, thank you everyone. Thank you, our panelists and our audience.